Welcome back to the Laura Ingraham Show, your healthy radio addiction. John Hinderocker filling in for Laura today, and we are delighted to be joined now by Reagan biographer Craig Shirley, author most recently of the just published Last Act, The Final Years and Emerging Legacy of Ronald Reagan. Craig Shirley, thanks for being with us.
You bet, John. How are you?
Just great. You know, the buzz today is all about last night's debate and the fact that these moderators were Democratic Party operatives trying to stick it to the Republican candidates.
No, you don't think so, really?
Yeah. Well, I think everyone thinks so, Craig.
I think so, too.
But a lot of people don't remember that in his time, the media were every bit as hostile to Ronald Reagan as they are to Republicans today. In some ways, maybe more so.
Even more so.
Yeah, even more so. How did Ronald Reagan deal with that and ultimately prevail over these media opponents?
Well, first of all, he dealt with it with humor, although he could lose his temper on occasion. But he really did. You know, there was a mantra coming out of the early days of the Reagan White House and even before that Reagan would talk over the heads of the American people, talk over the heads of the Washington establishment and the national media and go right to the people. And, in fact, he did. A president could ask for national broadcast time, and generally he would get it, and that's how he would do it. He would basically go over the heads. Now, inside Washington, it was one thing. Outside Washington, it was quite another thing. And I think that was really the beginning of the dichotomy between the Washington elites and the American people, and one that showed up today, showed up last night so sharply is divided now between. I mean, there's a permanent division. Let's face it, is that they have nothing in common. They might as well be two species trying to talk to each other.
Yeah, that's right. You know, it's interesting that on the GOP side, every presidential candidate wants to be Ronald Reagan. They all invoke his legacy and try to put themselves in his tradition. There really isn't anything quite like that on the Democratic side. You know, maybe you can go back to Franklin Roosevelt, but that's almost like Abraham Lincoln in terms of being a figure from the past. Out of today's...
Well, there was a time when John Kennedy's shadow loomed over the Democratic Party, but it was more kind of a cult personality than it was substantive.
That's right. It was never really policy. It was, you're right. It was personality driven. When you look at today's field of Republican candidates, what do you see in terms of similarities to Ronald Reagan as well as differences from him?
Well, you're right. All of them have invoked Reagan, and deservedly so. He was a very popular president. He was a very successful president, probably the most successful president. In fact, he was the most successful president of the 20th century. He and Franklin Roosevelt were the two most successful presidents. And part of the reason why is because they're always in touch with the American people. And so I would say that all of the candidates, in some way, shape, or form, are evocative of Ronald Reagan, but none of them has all of Reagan, all of them inside of them. Ted Cruz is his passion. Rand Paul is intellectual libertarianism. All of them in some way, you know, I mean, they all run as Reagan Republicans, and nobody, you know, for instance, up there last night was running as a Bush Republican, except for one. Except for one was running as a Bush Republican.
Sorry, the exception.
And look what happened to him.
Exactly, the exception that proves the rule in that case.
Yeah.
Now, one thing that really reminds me, and I lived through the late 1970s, I'm sorry to say, I remember them way too well, the Carter administration. One thing that feels really familiar to me. You know, I remember in the late 1970s when the economy was rotten, unemployment was high, inflation was rampant, economic growth was stagnant, if not negative. And for several years there, the Democrats were telling us, get used to it. This is the new normal. America's not going to be as prosperous as it used to be, and this is how it is. It's going to be this way. And Reagan rejected that, and that's really, I think, the most fundamental reason why he swept to victory in 1980. But we're living through that again. We have this slow economic growth. We have low labor force participation. We have an economy that is stagnant. That 7 years after the recession, they're still talking about recovery, not about boom. And the Democrats are telling us, get used to it. This is the new normal. 2% growth. This is the best we're ever going to do. Isn't the stage really set for a Republican candidate to reject that kind of gloom and pessimism?
Well, I think you're absolutely right, and more to your point is that Reagan himself identified, in his farewell address, he he talked about maybe two of his most important accomplishments were the restoration of the American economy, which created 19 million new jobs, and the restoration of America's morale. So you're absolutely right. The contrast between the late 70s and the late 80s is as different, as stark as night and day. And there's one constant that happened in those 8 intervening years, and that was Ronald Reagan. He changed everything. I think that, Marco Rubio is making a good stab at some inspirational talk, and so is Ted Cruz, and frankly, so is Donald Trump. I mean, he in a way is right now more evocative of Reagan than the others because of two things. One, he's challenging the status quo. He's challenging the establishment, which is what Reagan always did. He always challenged conventional wisdom. And the second was that he was always talking about the future, and that's what, because the Democrats under Jimmy Carter had given up the future as the centrality of their party. Under Franklin Roosevelt and under John Kennedy, the future had always been the province of the Democratic Party, and Reagan takes it because Carter gives it up in 1980, and for a time the Republican Party was the party of the future. Now, under George Bush and Karl Rove and others, is that we rejected it. So now, slowly, we're beginning to reestablish it again, as Obama is now rejecting it and talking about an era of scarcity, just as Jimmy Carter did.
Yeah, as I recall, you correct me if I'm wrong here, Craig, but as I recall, Ronald Reagan's strongest demographic as voters were young people, and that was precisely because he was the voice of optimism, and he was the voice of the future. Now, today we keep hearing about the GOP's problems connecting with young people, but isn't there a huge opportunity there?
Yeah, you bet, and you're absolutely right. Ronald Reagan, when he was reelected in 1984, he got about 59% of the overall popular vote. But among voters under 60, voters under 30, he got 66% of their vote. His approval rating among voters under 30 was extraordinarily high, much higher than it was among the overall population when he left office. And among the overall population, it was 71, 72%. Among voters under 30, it was 77, 78%. So, but he did two things, and you're absolutely right. He talked about the future, and he gave some of his most important policy speeches on American college campuses. At Notre Dame, George Washington, Eureka College, even at Moscow State University, he gave an important policy speech where he made a call to the young Muscovites there who were listening to the speech and the young Russians who were listening to his speech.
It's really interesting, Craig, because Reagan, of course, lived in a very different media environment. He was able to talk over the heads of the media to the American people at a time when there really weren't any alternative media. It really should be easier to do that today than it was then.
Well, but Reagan still took control of his own destiny, and he was best when he took control of his own destiny. The problem with the Republican Party and the Republican candidates is letting their destiny be decided by CNBC and CNN. And they need to, it wouldn't have been wouldn't have been wonderful if one of those contestants, one of those aspirants last night had backed away from it. Said, John, this is not your debate. This is our debate.
Craig Shirley, thanks for being with us.